We're going to keep our preview series going with a look at the great state of Michigan and the Michigan State Spartans specifically. Chris Solari covers all things Spartans for the Detroit Free Press, including a football team that's probably fair to say is in a massive transitionary period right now. Chris, thank you so much again for joining us on Big Ten Country.
Yeah, glad I could do it, guys. And transitionary period is probably a good way to describe it. It's very, very much in many ways similar but different to maybe 5 years ago when Mark D'Antonio retired. The things have changed. Obviously, the difference between the Mel Tucker era and the D'Antonio era was stark, which led to the change. Now Jonathan Smith has to pick up the pieces and try and get back to where they were under D'Antonio.
I was just going to ask you where things kind of stand right now with Jonathan Smith at the helm. I know this is a really big project, a lot of guys, in and out of the roster itself, but more so just kind of the culture of the program as a whole. The Mel Tucker ouster obviously captured national headlines the way that all went down, and Michigan State's now left to kind of try to really forge a new path because the stuff they've tried in the last few years really hasn't worked. So how is the, kind of opening of the Jonathan Smith era going in terms of kind of resetting the deck and kind of resetting the expectations and the trajectory of this program?
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. I mean, one of the things Mel Tucker did was really usher in the era of the transfer portal as a weapon for coaches and a way to rebuild a program. And you saw it work in 2021, and now everybody does it, and it's commonplace. So that's where Jonathan Smith starts, right where Mel Tucker kind of started to make a build and struggled to complete it. And before any of the other situations that led to his dismissal, Michigan State's football program was languishing. It wasn't able to run the ball. It wasn't able to stop opponents. And that's a heavy lift for Jonathan Smith and his new staff to correct. It brings in Joe Rossi from Minnesota, who has Big Ten experience, which I think is a big deal to getting that defense back to playing at the level that Michigan State fans are accustomed to. And really the program has shown over the past 2 decades that it is capable of doing. And then it's Brian Lindgren and Jonathan Smith running the offensive show to try and spark something that really, even under Mark D'Antonio, there was maybe 2 or 3 prolific offenses with Kirk Cousins and Connor Cook, but they were a grinder of a team. And you may see that kind of style here, at least until some of those young stars start to develop.
Chris, what's realistic? You bring up Mark D'Antonio, and I'm a Tide fan, so I can go back to, of course, Nick Saban being the head coach of the Spartans. What's true realistic expectations? Because we've had years where when, Michigan was down and Michigan State actually was kicking butt in that rivalry, but it kind of feels like the little brother in some ways. So what are realistic expectations for Jonathan Smith to get this program going, and how long does he has to meet those realistic expectations?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I do think that there is something to be said about when Jonathan Smith takes over with Michigan also in a transition period to Sharon Moore, because remember, Mark D'Antonio's first year was Lloyd Carr's last year. Mm-hmm. And then Michigan went through its changeover. And I think for Jonathan Smith, he said it at Big Ten Media Day last week that the big thing is to win more games than you lose. Well, that's obvious. That's a pretty obvious statement. But when you haven't gone to a bowl game in really 3 of the last 4 years, that's a big thing. They made it in that 2021 season, but not in 2020, not in 22, and not in 23. D'Antonio, one of the things he did, and when he took over the program in 2007 from the other John L. Smith, which is an interesting kind of comeback there. But I think one of the things that he wanted to establish was consistency in the program. And that consistency in 2007 and 2008 and 2009 meant getting to a bowl game. It meant getting to 6 wins, 7 wins, 8 wins. I think he had a 9-win season in there early in D'Antonio's tenure that really changed the level of expectations. Michigan State fans in 2007 would have been happy just to get to a bowl game. I think that D'Antonio altered those expectations because it really was basically like the 60s all over again, the 50s and 60s with Biggie Munn and Duffy Daugherty, when you had Mark D'Antonio putting Michigan State back in a national scope and showing that Michigan State in the current college landscape, and obviously it's changing again this year between the growth of the Big Ten and the growth of the college football playoff, but in the 14 playoff, Michigan State was one of them. That tells you it can be done, regardless of what Michigan's doing. Remember, they had Ohio State as a buzzsaw at that point that they had to compete with. So it wasn't like you can say it was little brother in some ways, but there were heavy hitters. There was Ohio State. There was Penn State. They were really gunning and firing at that point, and Michigan State still surpassed that. So I do think, though, that you have to look at the early part of the D'Antonio tenure and say it's got to be that kind of build. And I really think there are a lot of similarities between Jonathan Smith and D'Antonio in how they approach things and the type of players they're looking for to fit their system.
Kind of keeping it big picture here, Ken and I have talked quite a bit on this podcast about kind of welcoming in the 4 teams from the West Coast and kind of the way that makes it a little bit more difficult for the cream to rise to the top in this conference. We know that Ohio State and Oregon are probably 1 and 2, depending on how you want to align those. But you look at teams like Washington and USC specifically, and they kind of get into that area where they're kind of muddying up the middle of the conference and maybe making it more difficult to kind of parse out and determine who's kind of going upward. Do you think that at all has any sort of impact on the way that Michigan State is trying to build this thing? Do you think maybe it encourages them to be a little bit more patient, or do you think it actually is going to encourage them to try to stand out from that pack of teams in a more rapid fashion?
It's going to be interesting to see how that all fleshes out, because remember, I mean, it's not just the Big Ten growing too, it's the playoff growing. So, I mean, you want to get to be one of the teams in that field, you got to be not, instead of winning the Big Ten, now you got to be top 2, maybe top 3. And I think there's something to be said that there's enough name brands and enough high quality football between all these programs that are both coming in and that are already established that Michigan State should feel comfortable pushing for that. I mean, there's Iowa that, we talk about all day. We talk about Ohio State, Michigan. We'll throw Penn State in there now and again, but Iowa has been a very consistent program. Those are the kind of programs that, and Michigan State under D'Antonio showed it can do that. So those are the kind of programs I think that it will start to move into that back part of the college football playoff, and then your success changes, right? So, but at the same point, there's still that granular level that it's going to be hard to get away from wanting to compete for conference championships, because that's something tangible. And that's something that Michigan State under D'Antonio showed it can do in the expanded Big Ten. But now it's a little different, because I do think those 4 teams bring a lot. I mean, Washington's going to be in that transitionary phase with DeBoer leaving, but they were a quick rise. And if anything, you can see that it can be done on the quick.
What will the offense look like? You mentioned grinding it out. What will the offense look like with Aidan Chiles under center? We watched last year. There was a lot of duress under center last season, whichever quarterback was in there. And what offensive weapons are left in the cupboard to aid Aidan?
Yeah, and that's going to be, I think, it's his ball. I mean, there's no question. It was basically all but Jonathan Smith and Brian Lindgren in the spring saying this is his job, and they brought in a backup from North Dakota who has starting experience for one final year to have some veteran presence just in case of injury, because the other guys on the roster are true freshmen, because everything was gutted. I mean, there wasn't a quarterback left in that room in January from a year ago. And when you talk about grind it out, I think, and again, remember, Aidan Chiles got playing experience and good reps, in-game reps in a number of games, a number of competitive Pac-12 games, but he has yet to start a game. He has yet to play a full game. So when I say grind it out, I think you'll see him use his legs more, because I do think the offensive line is going to be a question. I mean, there's no doubt that when you have the changeover and turnover that they had up front, not only from last year, but also from the spring. I mean, it's basically bringing in a bunch of new guys on top of what already was learned. So he's going to have to use his mobility. He's going to have to use his best weapon, I think, is the guy who came with him in Jack Velling, the tight end. I think he's got a chance to be a pretty special player in the Big Ten and nationally, particularly if Chiles can get the ball and particularly if the line can give him time. I think Nate Carter's a good running back that showed last year after transferring from UConn that he can grind. They brought in a couple other transfers there. They've got some receivers. They really like Nick Marsh, true freshman, 4-star kid that kept his pledge, an in-state kid. And that's the big kind of building block that you remember when Mark Antonio started building, he built with those guys from Michigan and Ohio to compete with the Michigans and Ohio States. And I think that's where I think the parallel with D'Antonio and Jonathan Smith are. They've really invested in those kind of guys. Even a guy like Montori Foster, a Cleveland guy, he's a veteran. He's been a presence. He's had a world of athleticism. Injuries have kind of knocked him back a little bit, but I think he's got a chance to have a breakout year if Chiles can deliver the ball.
Yeah, it's just a roster that I look at and I can see maybe opportunities for the run game to get some things going, assuming that the run blocking can make it happen. But I do think that the backfield, especially, and like you said, with Chiles' ability to run the football, it seems as though that maybe is an opportunity for kind of that grinded out football that you were talking about. I mean, I look at what they got from Ron Lynch Adams coming in from Massachusetts, Nate Carter being in the program already. It feels like that is the type of thing that they're going to be able to do right out of the box. And as they kind of restructure this offense and kind of get everything going in the right direction, it almost does seem to me that kind of run game is going to be a definitive characteristic of this team. Do you think that's kind of a fair assessment of what they may look to do on offense?
I think you would hope to see that. And I think Michigan State fans hope to see that because people, I think the end of the D'Antonio era, they struggled to run the ball. I mean, after that 2015 season, when they won the Big Ten title and went to the playoff, the run game vanished. And even in 2017, when they had the bounce back with a 10-win season, they weren't great. They weren't that pound the ball Michigan State style that people know. And I think the game's evolved a little bit too, but 2018 and 2019 under D'Antonio were not great run years. And then no one really knew what to expect in 2021 after the COVID year and Tucker's second year. And they struck lightning with Kenneth Walker, and not just Kenneth Walker, but a veteran offensive line group that had guys that had played 5-6 years that were in front of him and allowed him to find those little creases that he turned into home runs. So, I think Carter has some of that ability, that big play burst that Walker did, but he didn't get a chance to show it last year because of all the turmoil and the struggles up front. I do think that Ron Lynch Adams, like you mentioned, he had a good year last year at UMass, like Carter, kind of trying to play up and show he can be at that level. So a lot of those components are going to need to come together, I think, because they do need to run the ball. And I think I don't think Chiles to me is what I would call a run first quarterback, but he's going to need to be elusive. And I think we saw that some during the spring, that he can not just run with the ball, but create on the move going laterally across if he does get chased. And I think that's going to help them quite a bit.
The allegations from Mel Tucker were terrible, but I think you kind of alluded to the fact that maybe the wheels were falling off of his program prior and during that. Safety Dylan Tatum mentioned that part of the reason they lost games after Tucker was let go is because they didn't like each other. What was taking place within the program outside of the allegations that came with Mel Tucker?
I think some of it was frustration. I think some of it was simply the fact that the way that Mel Tucker approached things, starting in 2021, he talked about building from the high school ranks, but ultimately Michigan State became ground zero for transfers, and really the ground zero and litmus test for what everybody else said. I asked Pat Fitzgerald that year because they opened that 2021 season against Northwestern. I asked him at the Big Ten Media Day, I said, do you think that more coaches, or do you think coaches are going to be watching this? He said, if it works, coaches are the greatest plagiarists and they will take it. And sure enough, I mean, that's exactly what happened. And you started to see the dominoes fall all around the country. Everybody else wanted to get their next Kenneth Walker. And I think Michigan State started to fall prey to that. And you know, the Moneyball ethos, right? You want to go the other way from the way the crowd is. And I do think they did a good job of bringing in some high level talent, but they never meshed. And some of that, I think, is when you have that much changeover. And I think it's going to be an issue around the country. I don't think it's just a Michigan State issue. I think that you're going to have trouble finding teams that have that it factor, that mesh, that sweat equity that they've built since their first day on campus as a freshman looking for their dorm, right? I mean, there's something to be said about that. There's something to be said about, you know, in particular up in these parts, going through the winter and going through a couple of those winters, right? And coming out and finally getting to hit somebody come August and enjoying the weather. So I think that's going to be, to me, one of the things where Tatum was talking about with that team last year. I think there was some of that. There were guys that just didn't know each other. And you can get through some tough times if you know the man next to you. I think he also said there was a little bit of bag chasing that came into play with guys that, were looking. I mean, they saw what Keon Coleman did, right? I mean, everybody saw Keon Coleman leave Michigan State. Talk about transfer portal being a good thing. Transfer portal can be a bad thing, right? So that's a high school guy that they brought in, left for what he felt were greener pastures, turned himself into a high round pick, and was on the verge of potentially playing for a national title at Florida State last year. So I think a lot of guys that saw that started to get enamored with both the opportunities to go and win now elsewhere, and also the monetary aspect that comes with the new NIL landscape.
I kind of like this idea of the mindset of the team and kind of meshing as a group and really needing to find that chemistry rather than kind of chasing individual glory, because you look at the way that Michigan State's schedule is laid out this year. You've got kind of some interesting tests early, but then you have just an absolute gauntlet in the middle of that schedule. You got Ohio State, then you got Oregon, then you've got Iowa, and then you've got the road trip to Michigan. That is, if it's not the hardest 4-game stretch of any team in the Big Ten this season, it is really close. I got to ask you, man, like, how do you think this team's going to approach something like that, where it's like, okay, we know you're kind of in this transitionary period, but this is just 4 heavyweight sluggers back to back to back to back. I mean, I think that's going to reveal a lot about the character of this team and kind of, at least the direction a little bit to a certain extent of the first year of Jonathan Smith's tenure. Yeah,
last year kind of had that a kind of grouping of a couple games like right out of the non-conference schedule where, and that they exited that non-conference schedule. They when Tucker was dismissed or suspended, they were 2-0, but they had a big time game right after that. They got blown out by Washington, right?
Remember that.
And then the wheels fell off from there because there was Ohio State and that. I mean, this is kind of the norm for Michigan State, right? I mean, the way it has been, there's always been this gauntlet. And, I think the Boston College game is going to be a good spot for them to kind of see where this team is, see where this program is a couple weeks into Jonathan Smith's first tenure, because, like 2021, I keep going back to that. I think this is kind of an unpredictable year. I mean, and that's, it's kind of a no-brainer to say that, because I do think that Jonathan Smith might be a better football coach than Mel Tucker as a head coach. I think the staff might be a little more in tune with the guys that they have and what they're trying to do. But there's so much change with the Big Ten, with the college football landscape, and obviously with the roster, with all the guys that have left the program and the new guys that have come in. So, talking about that sweat equity, these guys are getting to know each other. So could you strike lightning in a bottle? Maybe. I mean, but and again, this isn't just a Michigan State thing, I think, either. But Michigan State's got to worry about this because you got the new coach, you've got all these new faces, you've got new schemes, everything else. And a couple weeks in, you're not going to be sneaking up on anybody. You're not going to be sneaking up on the Ohio States of the world by that point, because there's going to be game tape.
My last question, we know that from being a defensive coordinator here with the Bears that Mel Tucker was a defensive coach. How did he leave the cupboard as far as the defense? We've already talked about offense, Chris.
Well, let's say this. leaving the cupboard and the groceries flying off the shelves in an earthquake are two different things, right? I mean, they had some really good pieces, and even in the spring, with Derek Harmon and Simeon Barrow and Maverick Hansen coming back for an extra year, they look like they would be really stout up the middle. And I'm of the belief, and this is the baseball guy, I mean, you always build up the middle, whether it be on the offense or defensive line. Barrow and Harmon both left. Now you got Maverick Hansen and a bunch of young guys that I think they've got some talent there, but they're going to be green. They brought in some transfers there that have experience. That's going to still be a question, though. I think the two biggest questions in this team, if you're just looking at it from a football standpoint, are how are the two lines going to play? And I really thought coming out of the spring, I thought there wouldn't be that question about the defensive line, but 2024 college football, right? I mean, what you see in April sure as heck isn't going to be what you see come August. And that's where Michigan State's at right now, trying to rebuild some of that, I guess, depth there. I think they're going to be solid at linebacker. I think Cal Halliday and Jordan Hall are two really good returning pieces there. Dylan Tatum, you mentioned him. He's going to be kind of their Swiss Army knife in the back end. They lost Jaden Mangum, starting safety, in an in-conference, in-state transfer to Michigan. So, circle that date on the calendar, because that's going to be some no love lost there. And same with Oregon and Barrow and Harmon going out to Oregon. That game will be circled. I think, the defense, though, I think Joe Rossi's experience I think two things here. One, Joe Rossi's experience in the Big Ten and knowing the opponents and having schemed for them and done a great job at Minnesota with PJ Fleck. I wanted to say Kirby Smart, but PJ Fleck up there in Minnesota, I think is a great hire. And I think he fits that Midwest Big Ten mindset. But then he's got guys around him who have coached against and schemed against the Pac-12 teams. He's got Demetrius Markham coming in as the defensive backs coach, had time at Oregon, had time at UCLA, and played at Michigan State. That's a big addition there. So I do think that one of the things this staff will be able to do is scheme up. And I think that's kind of, if you listen to anybody talking about Joe Rossi and the guys that he's got around him, they're schematically good. Whether or not they got the horses to last the 12-game season and maybe more, that's going to be an issue. And we'll see come maybe October or November just where they're at health-wise and where they're at development-wise with some of the young guys.
I do have to ask you one more question. I'm fairly certain that we addressed this with you last season when Michigan State had the Black Friday game against Penn State. They played it at Ford Field. I noted that their last game of this season is November 30th at home against Rutgers. Did they fix any of the issues up there in East Lansing, or are they kind of playing with fire here with the stadium being ready for potential cold weather? What's going on with that game?
I haven't heard anything about anything with the upgrades or anything. I'd be more interested to see what that weather forecast is going to be like, because they may not even, I mean, much like the Indiana game a couple years ago where they had to shut down the upper deck, they may not even need to worry about it if depending on how the season's going. I mean, it's Rutgers, it's not Penn State. So whoa. I mean, listen, I'm talking strictly from a traveling standpoint.
Okay.
Oh, it's fine, Chris. Say how you feel, Chris. Say how you feel. It's fine.
Strictly from a traveling standpoint, because I mean they know that Penn State would always travel for that Thanksgiving game, and it's a short drive versus the much longer drive or flight from Piscataway anywhere in the beautiful New Jersey, New York region that I love so dearly.
I've become known as the Rutgers kind of cheerleader on this podcast. So yes. Ken immediately I just saw him smirking, and it kind of got me too. But
hey man, I think that's Rutgers is going to be one of those teams that's going to be interesting to watch here. I think just because what's this new Big Ten going to be, right? I mean, the Rutgers, the Marylands, even Nebraska's, the teams that jumped into the Big Ten in the last decade plus. Now that it expands again, they're supposed to be old hats, and they're supposed to be dominating the new kids on the block like maybe some of those teams did. So maybe it's time for Rutgers to take that next step.
Chris, it's funny. I said I had one more question and I didn't want to cheat, but you did the cheat because I was going to ask you who should be a surprise this year, and you just gave us teams that may be a surprise this year. So I appreciate that out of you.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I do think that it's everything's wide open right now. I mean, other than you know who the top dogs are, right? You know that it's going to be Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, Penn State, right? There's the question marks after that I do think that there are, maybe about a half dozen teams, maybe 8 teams that could rise up, and we're still not even halfway through the conference, right?
There you go. See, this is why if you come down to Champaign for that November 16th game against the Spartans, Ken and I are definitely going to owe you a beer or two at Murphy's or something.
I'll be
Chris,
there.
Thank you so much for joining us here today on Big Ten Country. Always absolutely love that. Really great stuff on kind of the big picture of stuff going on up there in East Lansing, and really looking forward to talking to you during the season.
Likewise, guys, and I'm looking forward to that. That's one of the road trips that I don't have to fly to this year. I'll be coastal. I'll be going from East Coast to West Coast between Boston and Eugene. So looking forward to that little drive.
Get that credit card ready, buddy. Thank you so much for coming on.
Congrats, you finished the video. If you want to build on that success, download the NBC Sports Chicago app. It's got highlights, exclusive insights, and push alerts tailored to you. Everything you need to be a real Chicago sports fan. Download it now.